This started out on a Christmas Day, the 25th. It was an outrage, provoked by the irrepressible want for the freedom of a people. Eventually, the situation spiraled out of control, from Christmas Day all the way down into the new year, as the colonial authorities would launch a series of counterattacks against its rebel slaves who refused to be defeated. Such display of mutual cruelty in the name of survival would forever be a historic defiance of the meanings built around the nostalgic day of Christmas. And isn't this additionally why a huge number of blacks all around the world loathe every celebration that comes from such a beautifully sensational season of cheer? Christmas? For it was all nothing but a repeatedly traumatizing season for their enslaved ancestors in those dark eras of slavery. Now sit back. This is going to get really interesting. The Christmas Rebellion, also known as the Baptist War, the Sam Sharp Rebellion, the Christmas Uprising, and the Great Jamaican Slave Revolt of 1831 to 1832, was an 11-day rebellion that started on the 25th December 1831 and involved up to 60,000 of the 300,000 slaves in the colony of Jamaica. Let us fill you in on the background for a quick second. The said rebellion was sparked by a number of factors, including: number 1, a denial of an extra day's holiday at Christmas. Number 2, rumors that emancipation had been granted in Britain but was being withheld by the planters. Number 3, the economic depression that affected some impoverished whites, making them allies of the rebels. Number 4, inflammatory speeches and articles in the newspapers written by Jamaican planters. The rebellion was led by Samuel Sharp, a Baptist preacher, who called for the enslaved to stop working on Christmas Day. The rebellion began peacefully as a general strike, but soon turned violent. The rebellion spread rapidly to other plantations, including the Boyne Estate. The British forces and the Jamaican government overpowered the armed slaves by the first week of 1832. And now, consequences. The rebellion was militarily unsuccessful, but it played a major part in the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire. Within 18 months, William IV gave his royal assent to the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833. Now that was the summary. Let us further into a little basics. As the warm Caribbean sun dipped into the horizon in December 1831, a sense of foreboding settled over the island of Jamaica. The white planters, who had grown wealthy and complacent on the backs of their enslaved laborers, slept fitfully in their grand estates, unaware of the storm that was brewing. For months, whispers of discontent had been circulating among the enslaved population, their voices hushed, but their determination growing with each passing day. The planters had tried to ignore the rumors, to dismiss them as mere fantasy, but deep down they knew that something was amiss. The enslaved individuals who had toiled for generations in the scorching sun, their bodies broken and their spirits worn, had finally reached a breaking point. They had decided to rise up, to speak for the freedom that had been denied to them for so long. The uprising of over 60,000 Jamaicans that changed the very nature of revolt is a story we are solemnly reminded of today, at such a sensational and nostalgic time of cheer and merry Christmas. Before we delve deeper into this pivotal moment in history, we would like to take a moment to express our gratitude for your presence here. If you find this content informative and engaging, we kindly request your support. Please consider liking this video, sharing it with your network, and subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to continue producing documentaries that shed light on overlooked narratives, giving voice to the untold stories that shape our understanding of the world. Now let's get down to the full digest.
Eyes down!
It was the year 1831, and the enslaved people of Jamaica had had enough. Led by the fearless Samuel Sharp, a Baptist preacher and visionary leader, they embarked on a daring quest for freedom and equality. Born in 1801 in Montego Bay, Samuel Sharp grew up as a house slave. Unlike many slaves, he was literate, having been educated by his master, who was also named Samuel Sharp. His master treated him very well and allowed him certain privileges. He would thus become his master's right-hand man, and in no time would be baptized, subsequently becoming a lay deacon and leader of the congregation at the Birch Hill Baptist Church. As a house slave, Samuel Sharp also had special responsibilities, one of which was to take the jobbing slaves, those hired out to others, to work. While carrying out his daily duties, he became disgruntled with the way in which slaves were treated, he himself included. He wanted to be free. And because the British allowed slaves to hold religious meetings, Sharp, during his evangelism, started preaching about freedom from slavery. Samuel Sharp had been permitted to travel between plantations for the ostensible reason of teaching Bible lessons and leading small worship services. This he did, but he also used the opportunity to appoint cell leaders who appointed their own small groups. During this period, Sharp created a ritual called Taking the Swear, in which new recruits would promise on the Bible to sit down after Christmas and not work until their demands were met. Sharp did the first secret swearings, but from then on, his own case officers did the work of exponential recruitment. In this way, and within one of the most repressive societies on earth, he built a connected network of strangers that stretched 70 miles in all directions. Sharp's development of safe houses was also ahead of its time. Every Jamaican plantation had a section in the white ruling class called the Negro Village, a main street of individual houses occupied by enslaved people. Field hands typically occupied small huts, but those in senior labor roles tended to have frame houses. In these elite houses, Sharp preached about the business, which was later called the Christmas Rebellion. With the information he had gathered over the years, his firm belief was that the only way to achieve freedom was through armed resistance, and with that, his top-level recruits used most of the elite houses for the most sensitive meetings, stockpiled weapons in them, and even created their own military-style uniforms, blue jackets with red sashes. Going forward, to understand the dynamics at play during this uprising, it is vital to understand the social structure of the 19th century colonial Jamaica. Jamaica, like much of the West Indies, was what was known as a plantocracy. In this arrangement, a minority of white European settlers, human traffickers, and plantation owners dominated the majority of enslaved Africans on the island. Conscious of their significant numerical disadvantage, with Africans vastly outnumbering whites with a ratio of about 12 to 1, planters deployed ferocious violence to discipline their slaves at home and used their substantial wealth and influence to lobby against abolitionists in Parliament and the press, determined to protect their interests and maintain the status quo. But despite their efforts, the sun was setting on slavery in the British Empire, and hopes of emancipation around the corner emboldened the enslaved population to take matters into their own hands. By 1831, the British Parliament began discussing the abolition of slavery throughout the empire, and this displeased many Jamaican planters. Sharp, on his part, was a keen follower of the abolition debates happening in Parliament. To stay informed, he would read both local and foreign newspapers, ensuring he was up to date on the latest developments. But Sharp didn't stop there. He also made sure to share this information with his congregation, keeping them informed about the progress of the abolition movement. This way, Sharp was not only educating himself, but also spreading awareness and mobilizing his community about the issue of abolition. Thomas Burchill, a missionary in Montego Bay, returned from England following Christmas vacation. Many of the Baptist ministry expected that he would return with papers for emancipation from the king, William IV. They also thought that the king's men would enforce the order. However, discontent would escalate among the slaves when the Jamaican governor announced that no emancipation had been granted. In that month of December that same year, 1831, under the mistaken belief that freedom had already been granted to the enslaved in Jamaica by the British Parliament, and that local planters refused to abide by the decision, Sharp organized a protest. The rebellion was strategically timed to coincide with the peak sugarcane harvest season in Jamaica. Sharp knew that disrupting the harvest would have a devastating impact on the plantation owners and the colonial economy. Sharp's plan was simple: organizing a peaceful general strike where enslaved individuals would collectively refuse to work unless their demands for better working conditions, more freedom, and a working wage were met. This strike was strategically planned to begin on the day of Christmas in 1831, a time when the enslaved community would normally be given a brief respite from their labor. It was intended to be a non-violent form of protest, with enslaved individuals simply refusing to work until their demands were met. Sharp and his followers believed that by withholding their labor, they could pressure the plantation owners and managers to negotiate and grant them better working conditions and more freedom. Their refusal to work would prevent the sugar cane from being cut, resulting in the loss of the crop. This would simultaneously exert significant economic pressure on the plantation owners and colonial authorities, forcing them to consider the rebels' demands for better working conditions, more freedom, and ultimately, emancipation. Enlisted to be his military commanders were fellow literate enslaved Africans, spanning several different estates, illustrating the effectiveness of the vast communication network known colloquially as the slave grapevine. As the Christmas of the said year of event fell on a Sunday, which apparently was to be a traditional day of rest, Samuel Sharp had assumed that the enslaved workers would be entitled to the following Monday, which was Boxing Day, and Tuesday off as well. Seizing this opportunity, Sharp decided that the protest was to begin on that Sunday, December the 25th, 1831. The rebellion had begun in the parish of St. James, with a group of enslaved individuals, led by Samuel Sharp himself. As news of the uprising spread all through the whole of Jamaica, an estimated number of 60,000 slaves, from the total slave population of 300,000, took part in the rebel assaults on plantation property, taking over large rural parts of St. James Parish. The initial peaceful demonstration soon became a violent uprising, and out of a population of 600,000, an estimated 60,000 took up arms to resist their oppression. Any pretense of a peaceful demonstration was lost when Kensington Estate was set ablaze by enslaved rebels, with the rebellion taking place in earnest soon after. While initially some plantation owners fought back, they were no match for the tactics of Sam Sharp and his military commanders. As the day wore on into the next, the embers of rebellion continued to glow, and by the next morning, the strike soon spread to other parishes including St. James, Trelawney, and Westmoreland, and to some sections of St. Elizabeth Parish. By this time, the rebellion was now a raging inferno, fueled by the deep-seated desire for freedom that had been burning within the enslaved individuals for generations. With a fierce determination, they began to target the symbols of their oppression, burning plantations to the ground, destroying crops, and attacking their enslavers. The once peaceful countryside was now a battleground, with the sound of drums, conch shells, and gunfire echoing through the hills and valleys. The colonial authorities, caught off guard by the rapid spread of the rebellion, scrambled to respond. Governor Sir William Lindsay, determined to maintain order and protect the interests of the plantation owners, deployed troops to quell the rebellion. The militia, composed of British soldiers and local volunteers, was tasked with restoring order and crushing the rebellion. But the enslaved individuals, fueled by their desire for freedom, were not easily intimidated. They continued to fight back, using guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the terrain to launch surprise attacks on the colonial forces. The stage was set for a brutal and bloody conflict, one that would leave a lasting impact on the island of Jamaica. As the colonial authorities struggled to contain the rebellion, they found themselves facing a determined and resourceful foe. The rebels, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, fought bravely, using their intimate knowledge of the island's terrain to launch surprise attacks on the colonial forces. But the authorities were determined to crush the rebellion, and they responded with brutal force, killing hundreds of enslaved individuals and burning their homes to the ground. The violence and destruction only seemed to intensify as the days passed, and by December 27, 1831, Jamaica was an island in chaos. The rebellion, now in its third day, continued to spread its tentacles across the island, leaving a trail of destruction and violence in its wake. Reports poured in from all corners of the island, telling of plantations ablaze, crops destroyed, and enslavers attacked. The once peaceful countryside was now a war zone, with the sound of gunfire, screams, and wailings filling the air. As the colonial authorities struggled to contain the rebellion, they turned their attention to capturing its leaders. Samuel Sharp, the charismatic Baptist preacher who had sparked the rebellion, was among the first to be arrested. The authorities, hoping to decapitate the rebellion by capturing its leader, threw Sharp into prison, charging him with inciting the uprising. Despite the arrest of Sharp and other suspected leaders, the rebellion showed no signs of slowing down. In fact, it seemed to gain momentum, as if the very act of arresting its leaders had galvanized the enslaved individuals to fight even harder for their freedom. The colonial authorities, realizing that they had underestimated the depth of feeling among the enslaved population, began to worry that they might be facing a full-blown revolution. As the situation spiraled out of control, the colonial authorities would launch a series of counterattacks against the rebels on the 28th of that same month of December, with more troops and militia being deployed to quell the uprising. It was a sorry sight, the sounds of gunfire and cannons echoing through the hills and valleys. The authorities, confident in their superior firepower and training, expected to quickly crush the rebellion and restore order to the island. But the rebels were not easily intimidated. Well organized and determined, they continued to fight back against their oppressors. As the last days of 1831 ticked away, the rebellion in Jamaica reached a fever pitch. By the 29th of December, Jamaica was already a landscape of smoldering plantations and charred ruins, the aftermath of the rebels' daring raids on colonial strongholds. But despite their initial successes, the rebels soon found themselves faced with a formidable foe. The colonial forces at this time had been reinforced by fresh troops, determined to crush the uprising once and for all. The battle on December the 29th was nothing short of intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The rebels, however, refused to back down, driven by their desire for freedom and their determination to resist the brutal system of slavery that had held them captive for so long. As the day wore on, the colonial forces began to gain the upper hand as they pushed the rebels back and regained control of key strongholds. But the rebels were far from defeated. The day wore on. It was now the 30th day of December. The rebels proved to be full of plans, resilience, and readiness. They had launched a series of surprise attacks on colonial forces, catching them off guard and inflicting significant casualties. The fighting was the fiercest, and the mutual surroundings now rife and boiling with stupendous destruction. Such display of mutual cruelty in the name of survival was a historic defiance of the meanings built around the nostalgic day of Christmas, with rebels and colonial forces clashing in a maelstrom of gunfire, screams, and wailing. Despite their bravery, however, the rebels were ultimately outnumbered and outgunned, and they were forced to retreat and regroup. By December the 31st, the British authorities were forced to implement martial law on the island amid the chaos, and had no choice but to ask for assistance from the Maroons, an independent community made up of runaway slaves and very skilled fighters. The intervention of the Maroons proved decisive in crushing the rebellion and capturing Sam Sharp's deputies in command and a number of other leaders, including Campbell and Dehaney. Hundreds of rebels had been killed during the fighting, compared with only a handful of whites. Many more rebels were captured and killed after the fighting had ceased, while the property damage inflicted upon slave owner properties was immense. At this time, the rebels knew that their time was running out. The colonial forces had regained control of the island, and the rebels were exhausted, battered, and bruised. But even in defeat, the rebels refused to surrender. They vowed to continue their fight for freedom, even if it meant going underground and waging a guerrilla war against their oppressors. And so, as the old year gave way to the new, the rebels slipped away into the shadows, their spirits unbroken and their determination to fight for freedom burning brighter than ever. On January 2nd, 1832, the colonial authorities launched a major assault on the rebel stronghold of Kensington Estate, which was located just outside of Montego Bay. The rebels, led by men like Thomas Dove and William Turner, put up a fierce resistance, but they were ultimately outnumbered and outgunned. Many rebels were killed or captured, and the colonial authorities claimed a major victory. But the rebels still didn't give up. On January the 3rd, 1832, a group of rebels launched a surprise attack on the colonial forces in the town of Falmouth. The attack was led by a rebel named James Harris, who had managed to evade capture despite being one of the most wanted men in Jamaica. The rebels inflicted significant casualties on the colonial forces, but they were ultimately forced to retreat. As the rebellion entered its final days, the colonial authorities began to round up suspected rebels and bring them to trial. The trials were often brutal and unfair, with many of the accused being sentenced to death or transportation. The Christmas Rebellion, which lasted for approximately 11 days, resulted in significant loss of life. Over 200 enslaved individuals and 14 white overseers or planters lost their lives during the uprising. In the aftermath, the colonial authorities launched a brutal crackdown on suspected participants. With over 500 enslaved individuals being convicted and punished, and many others being hanged. As a warning to others, the severed heads of the executed were displayed around their plantations. Those who escaped execution were subjected to harsh treatment, suffering physical abuse and brutal punishment. Sharp was named the key figure of the rebellion. In a remarkable display of selflessness, Sharp surrendered to the colonial authorities in an effort to protect the Baptist missionaries who had been wrongly blamed for inciting the rebellion. Despite his bravery, Sharp was eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On May the 23rd, 1832, he was led to the gallows in Montego Bay, where he was hanged for his role in the rebellion. Sharp was buried like a criminal in the sands of Montego Bay Harbor, but his remains were later recovered and buried beneath the pulpit at the Birchell Baptist Church. The rebellion's impact was felt far beyond Jamaica's shores. It, along with other rebellions, including the Haitian Revolution, made European enslavers realize that controlling large slave populations was unsustainable. This realization contributed massively to Britain's decision to abolish slavery in 1833, just 2 years after the Christmas Rebellion. However, the road to full emancipation was long and arduous. The act stipulated that formerly enslaved individuals would have to undergo a period of apprenticeship under their former masters before being granted full freedom. It wasn't until 1838 that unconditional emancipation was granted. In closing, the legacy of the Christmas Rebellion extends beyond its impact on the abolition of slavery. It also highlights the bravery and determination of enslaved individuals who fought for their freedom. Samuel Sharp's leadership and the rebels' willingness to challenge the status quo paved the way for future generations to continue the fight for equality and justice. Within 18 months of the rebellion, William IV gave his reluctant royal assent to the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833. Samuel Sharp, however, did not live to see the fruits of his labor. He was hanged on May the 23rd, 1832, before the act was passed. Nevertheless, the revolutionary methods of the business had ultimately triumphed against the most powerful government in the world, leading to the emancipation of over 800,000 people. That brings us to the end of yet another heartwarming video. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a pivotal moment in Black history. We appreciate your engagement and reflection on this difficult yet important chapter of the Black history. Every life has a story, and every community has a history. If you're gathering with friends and family during this holiday season, I encourage you to share a few stories and listen to those of others. Conversations about the past empower the future of our human time machine. And if you no doubt did learn a thing or two, join us next time as we continue to shed light on untold stories and uncover the complexities of our shared human experiences. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on upcoming videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one ahead.